Before we start the show this week, I want to take a second and talk about this new podcast that just dropped. It's called Marvels. Based on the graphic novel by Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross, it's an incredible window into the Marvel Universe. The show takes place in the backdrop of the Fantastic Four showdown with Galactus, but it follows a photographer, student, and journalist on their mission to investigate a sprawling, superpowered conspiracy theory. Now, I took a listen to this trailer, and it's incredible. It really, gave me goosebumps at how cool it is. It feels like the comic book has come to life in audio form. So head over to marvelspodcast.com to take a listen to that. And if you actually want to listen to the whole show, go over to StitcherPremium.com and sign up with the code COMIC, COMIC. You'll get a free month of Stitcher Premium, which will let you listen to the Marvels podcast right now. That's StitcherPremium.com with the promo code COMIC. This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two just really great people to be around. Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Kate Lamphere.
Hi.
Thank you both for joining me this week. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to just talk about comic books. I know Pokemon came out this week, but who even cares? Because you know what? Comic books came out on Wednesday, and they're coming out next week. I don't think Pokemon comes out every week. That's what I thought, people. Gotcha. Boom. Burned. Let me ask the question I ask every single week. How have you guys been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Paul.
Hey, Mike. I've been pretty good. I've been reading a lot of comics. It's actually tough to decide what I want to talk about on the show today. I've been reading so much great stuff lately, so that's a nice change of pace. I think the winter weather we've had here in Michigan has been conducive to staying inside and reading a lot, so I think that's helped.
Gotcha.
But yeah, a couple of things I wanted to mention on the show that I read recently that I really enjoyed. First one is COPRA. I don't think we decided the best way to pronounce that. COPRA numbers 1 and 2. This is technically the second volume of COPRA by Michel Fiffe. If you aren't familiar with the book, Fiffe self-published the first 31 issues of COPRA, and it's been collected in nice collections from Bergen Street Comics. But it was recently picked up by Image, and now the second volume is a continuation of that story, but it started with a new number 1 with the Image eye on the front. And it's really nice for Fiffe to kind of be able to graduate, quote unquote, from self-publishing to Image, get a little bit more distribution, because this book deserves an audience. It's such an amazing comic book.
Absolutely.
And what's nice is if you haven't read the previous volume of COPRA, the first issue of this volume, Fiffe does a really good job of explaining the backstory. There's some back material in the issue where he recaps every one of the issues he did previously, the big events in those issues. He introduces the characters. So you can jump in with this number 1 and be all basically caught up, although you definitely should go back and read the original stuff because it's fantastic. Did I mention it's a great book? Because every time I read an issue of COPRA, I'm just stunned by how visually exciting the comic book is. Fiffe's been able to capture, it's not a Ditko homage. He captures the action that Steve Ditko comics have with his own sort of flair. Reminds me of Ditko, reminds me of Steranko, reminds me of Howard Chaykin, early Howard Chaykin, especially the way he uses sound effects and text in the pages. And there's lots of just full page compositions. It's just an amazing looking comic. If you're not reading, if you like comics in any capacity, you should be reading COPRA. That's what I'll say, because it's such a great example of the medium. One final thought on this new volume. For some reason, they changed paper stock between the issues. So the first issue has a matte sort of newsprint-like paper stock, just like the previous volume collections did. The second issue has the glossy Image-style paper that most Image comics have. Hopefully they go back to the original matte paper. I like it a lot more, but that'd be my one nitpick from an otherwise flawless comic book.
Yeah, maybe they'll do that for the collected edition, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I feel like
hopefully.
That's definitely a better feel for the collected edition. I'm actually surprised to hear that the single issues did that. Because I feel like when other publishers do that, even at Image, the book usually costs an extra $1, just because I think it's a different paper stock. So was the cover price the same for both of those issues?
It was the same. It was both $3.99, and I think issue 1 it actually had a few extra pages, a little bit longer than normal. So I guess it's it's a good way to get people to pick up the book with the same price point. And, as I said, you have to be reading COPRA. I mean, it's visually the most exciting book, I think, on the stand. I'm glad it's back, and I'm glad it's getting the bigger distribution through Image.
Yeah, that's awesome. I look forward to reading it in collected edition. That's the only way I found I can read that series.
I get it. Yeah. But Yeah, it's great stuff. So I'm glad it's back, and those first 2 issues were exactly what you expected. So
awesome.
The other book I want to mention is another Image book. This was November #1 or Volume 1. This is by Matt Fraction writing it. Elsa Chartier, I'm butchering that name.
Chartier, maybe?
Yeah, Chartier. Yeah, that sounds good. She's doing the pencils for the book. Matt Hollingsworth on colors, and Kurt Ankeny on letters. This is the first of a series of 3 OGNs, basically, that this team is doing. And I kind of popped up on Hoopla, and I was like, oh, I liked the cover image so much. I like Fraction stuff. So I decided to check it out, and it's fantastic. It's basically a sort of gritty crime noir story that all takes place on the same night, and it's 3 different women whose events or lives that night sort of intersect, even though they're not aware that they're intersecting. So the first section is about a woman who gets hired by a mysterious stranger to do a job where she's just basically looking after an apartment, so to speak. It's more complicated than that, but I'll leave it vague, to avoid any sort of spoilers. But she's doing this mysterious job. The second section is about a woman who finds a gun that's related to the first story on the street. She calls the police. And then the third story is the 911 operator that answers the call about the missing gun, or the gun that the woman finds. So it's a really interesting mystery. It's part noir, crime fiction. It feels like a mystery that I need to reread a couple times, because these 3 women's lives are being sort of intersected because involvement of one particular male character, and the section of the story that explains his background I found not confusing, but there's a lot to unpack there. So it's a book I feel that the mystery will become more apparent after you go back and reread it, and it'll be fun to reread because it's such a great looking book. Chartier's pencils remind me of Colleen Coover on Bandette, or there's elements of Darwin Cook's Parker in it because it's a crime book. Obviously, there's the connection there, but her pencils and Hollingsworth's colors are reminiscent of the Parker books, because Hollingsworth colors each section a different sort of color palette, and it's a color palette that's muted and kind of makes each section look almost monochromatic. So the first impulse I looked at the book, I was like, oh, this is like he's just using a monochromatic single colors. But the more as I went through it, I realized he wasn't. It just gives that impression. It's a really striking visual. And then Ankeny's letters, it's a very unique it looks like hand lettered style. So overall, the package, it feels really unique and something really different from Fraction I haven't seen him do in a while, and I was really surprised by it. So I'm curious to check out the next 2 volumes as they come out over the next few months. It could be a really special book.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. I think I saw this on the shelf, and I mean, I wanted to pick it up, but I don't need more physical books in my house. Maybe I'll snag this on digital or something, maybe Hoopla or something in my area. Yeah,
I highly recommend it. I was pleasantly surprised by it, so...
Very cool. It's interesting, just really quick, I feel like Matt Fraction was like on the top of the world for a few years, and then he kind of disappeared. And not to say that that's bad by any means, because I feel like, other creators have done that. But I noticed that he's just kind of putting out little books here, like left and right, like under the radar in some capacity. And I'm sure they sell well for people that are maybe following his stuff. But it's interesting to see him go from the height of comic fandom to just kind of like another person in the sea of comics, and I don't think that that's bad, like I said, but it's just interesting to see that change of things, because I think the books that he's putting out now are far more interesting than maybe like Fear Itself, for instance. I know that was years ago, but that was kind of the peak for him in some ways. Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to speculate too much because I don't know exactly, but it does feel like between the work at Marvel and the success of Sex Criminals, it'd be easy to get burned out on that stuff. But yeah, he's doing great stuff between this, and I'll talk about Jimmy Olsen a little bit later in the show, but that's another book he's doing that is fantastic.
Right.
So yeah.
Exactly. Cool. Well, Kate, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
I've been great. I have been reading a lot of comics also, and it was also very hard to decide what to talk about. So I picked up a couple of #1s while I was at my local comic shop, instead of reading all the things I already own, as usual. I picked up Ghosted in L.A. This is written by Sina Grace with art by Siobhan Keenan, colors by Kathy Lee, and letters by D.C. Hopkins. This is a boombox title, so I was expecting feel-good YA, and it's exactly what I got. This girl follows her boyfriend to Los Angeles to go to school. She has a fight with her best friend just before leaving her hometown. She doesn't like her roommate. Basically, everything's going wrong for her. It turns out that the boyfriend's not that great. She happens into this giant mansion someplace in town, and it turns out that there's a whole bunch of ghosts there. And she's like, look, you guys seem great, and my life is awful, so can I just stay here? And it's pretty cute. The one of the ghosts seems to maybe have some kind of nefarious ideas of what this girl should do with her time, and so I'm a little bit concerned for her, but it makes me want to read the next issue. So I also really like this protagonist. She's really unique in terms of what I'm usually drawn to in comics. She's really chatty, including a lot of like aside boxes where she's kind of talking to herself or just some digression in the conversation, and nobody else around her seems to be really rising to the things that she wants to talk about, which is part of the what's going wrong, but it makes her a very unique protagonist. And she's also Jewish, which comes up with the necklace that she wears. Her roommate is very religious for a different religion and seems to not like their difference there. And she makes a couple of jokes in the stories about like, there's ghosts here. The Catholics were right about purgatory. So I am drawn to read issue number 2. It was very cute.
Nice.
Man, I just Googled this. Holy cow, this is like the prettiest book I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Like, how do you draw so many pretty people in one book? I don't understand it. This is like, I don't know if you guys read Snot Girl by Brian Lee O'Malley, and her name is escaping me, but everybody in that book is also very pretty and like super hot. It's like Wicked and Divine. Some people out there just have this talent to draw incredibly beautiful people. This is exactly one of those books.
Yeah, there's also really good fashion in this book. Like, all of the clothes looked really good.
Yeah. Yes, that's the Snot Girl vibe I was kind of pulling from that.
Yeah. The other number 1 I picked up was Invisible Kingdom. It's written by G. Willow Wilson with art by Christian War and letters by Sal Cipriano. And this sounded really familiar when I was at the shop, but it wasn't on my to-read list. So I picked it up on a whim, but it turns out that we have talked about it on the show before, and that volume 1 is already out. So this turned out really well for me because issue number 1, which my LCS still had for some reason, was fantastic, and I want to read volume 1 immediately, please. This book is like corporate espionage, but in space, and there's 2 protagonists, storylines. One of them is kind of reminiscent of like the Firefly smuggler plot line, but she's like a captain of a transport crew, which is working legally for the corporation. And then the other storyline is a nun, N-O-N-E, nun, but it is for a religious community. So there's 2 very different storylines, but I think that they're both heading in the same direction about figuring out what's going on with this corporation. And I was just so impressed by the character building. Everybody was so real. All of the relationships with people were really real, which was not great in some cases because the nun is met with a lot of racism because their race has 4 genders, which is fascinating, but doesn't seem to be a great thing in this planet that they're on at the moment. So I'm just super into the story. I want to learn more, and luckily the whole arc is out. So
yeah. And Christian Ward's art is unfucking believable. This dude was made to draw high sci-fi, crazy concept stuff. I love this book. It's beautiful. I'm glad that you got on board, Kate, is also what I'm saying.
I'm just shocked I didn't put it on my to-read list. I mean, I'm usually drawn to the stuff that you talk about, Mike, and this just never made it onto my Goodreads account for some reason.
That's right. I'll just start giving you a list, outside of the show. Well, for me this week, I read some books like on and off. I don't know what it is. I just haven't had the energy to read too much. But I did, like last Sunday, after the show, I basically sat down and read like 30 comics in a row. So I kind of made up for a whole week's worth of reading. But the 2 books I do want to talk about really quick are Ascender Volume 1. This is Jeff Lemire, Dustin Nguyen. This is the continuation of their Descender series. And all I want to say is fucking A in my goddamn heart. Everything is terrible and broken inside of me. And this book is the reason for that. It's fantastic. It's a great continuation. It doesn't feel like like I missed anything. Like I was worried that there was going to be like a ton of like history to fill things in between Descender and Ascender, and the way that the story is crafted, it's done in such a way that Nguyen and Lemire explain things to you as the book's going on. And so for people like me who have been reading Descender since the beginning, it wasn't anything new, but it was like a nice refresher of, oh, here are these people, here's this thing, here's what's subtly changed from when we last left the story, because there's a time jump. And yeah, I don't want to spoil anything, because I think you all should stop what you're doing, go read all of Descender and then Ascender Volume 1, and then turn this episode back on. But it's a beautiful book. Nguyen's art is, as expected, unbelievably precise somehow with watercolor, and it impresses me every single page turn throughout this volume. I think his work has only gotten better since Volume 1, since the first issue of Descender. And I mean, and this is saying from a guy who's absolutely established in comics. Like, it's not like Nguyen just started. The dude's been doing comic books for years, but you can tell by reading this book that he's really kind of honed in on how to do this very precise style of pencils with very elaborate watercolors on top of it. And it's always impressive to see with this book, especially with the range of characters and shapes, and to do high sci-fi that usually requires like a precise, like a Clayton Crane style. To see it be done with this watercolor that's usually very flowy and airy is very impressive. And this issue, or this volume in specific, really touches on that, even to some fantasy elements. I won't go into that, but it's very, very good. Otherwise, I also read this independent book. It's called Meal. It's published by Iron Circus Comics. This is by Blue Delaquanti and Soleil Ho. It's a food comic that is essentially about how to make food with insects, and the history kind of behind that to a certain extent. This story follows a main character who's basically moved across the country to try to get a job at this restaurant that's going to open up, that's only going to serve food-based products, or food products that have insects in them. And the idea is like, hey, it's an Asian Latin fusion kind of place, so you can get tacos, or you can get pho, or you can get something and it's going to have insects in it in some capacity as the protein, instead of chicken or beef or tofu. And it's a really interesting concept. I picked this up at FlameCon earlier this year just because I love Blue's work. If you haven't read Oh Human Star, boy, it's probably the best webcomic I've ever read. It hits you right in the feels, and it's such an interesting, strange concept that I can't recommend it enough. Imagine robots in the future, but also two dudes are in love. That's kind of the basis of it. And but Meal, is a very down to earth, real story. This, like I said, this person moves across the country to go work at this restaurant, and along the way they kind of get a history of a handful of cultures, particularly Mexican, Cambodian, and history from the people that she meets, about these cultures that have used insects in their food for generations. And the main character herself, she is half Japanese, and she talks about how she, met her grandparents in Japan, and they went and had crickets, or these Japanese style crickets. I don't remember what exactly they're called, but it's a really interesting look at an alternate take on vegetarianism. And I think that, it's kind of a, question in the air, is eating insects still considered vegetarianism? But, even still, I really enjoyed it. It was like a nice, quick book. It's like 120 pages with some recipes in the back on if you want to get your own mealworms. Here's how you make mealworm tacos. It's really, really cool. So I highly recommend this to people if you guys get a chance.
So, Mike, obviously you're going to have to try the recipes out, right?
Well, the thing is, like, I'm not really scared to eat a mealworm. It's the tarantulas that I'm scared to eat. I'm not really up. Yeah, they talk about, there's this, like, you deep fry a tarantula, and that's like a snack. And I'm like, it sounds cool in concept, but I don't know if I could eat a spider, especially because it's still in the spider shape. Yeah. Whereas with mealworms, you can kind of grind them up, or you can smash them up and stuff, and they don't really look like mealworms anymore. Yeah. So I don't know. But yeah, I'm not opposed to trying it. I just, one, am bad in the kitchen, and two, I don't even know where I could. I mean, I live in New York. I could probably find somewhere that'll sell me mealworms and tarantulas and stuff, and crickets to eat. But it's just a matter of actually putting the meal together. So
right.
I don't know. Maybe I'll send it over to you, Paul. You can tell me. You're vegetarian, so you'll try weird shit, right? That's how that works.
Well, yeah, but
I'm kidding.
The whole eating animals thing is kind of that's a no-no. So yeah.
But let's take a second. Let's move on to talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comics are dropping on November 20th, 2019. Let's hear what you guys are excited about this week. Let's start with you, Kate.
First, I just want everybody to know that IDW is putting out a Big Hero 6 comic. Yes, like the movie. And it looks like it's directed toward younger kids, so it's probably not something that I'm going to check out. But if you have kids, or if you like kid comics, the movie was delightful, so the comic will probably be delightful. But what I'm excited for is Grass Kings Volume 2 by Matt Kent and Tyler Jenkins. I read the first volume in trade, and so I've been trade waiting the second volume. This title has totally fallen off my radar. I didn't even realize that it was still going on, but I'm very excited that Volume 2 is out.
And Paul, what about you?
Well, as I mentioned, I want to talk more about Matt Fraction, specifically his book, Superman's Pal, Jimmy Olsen. Issue number 5 comes out this week, and this has been probably the funniest book on the stands the past few months it's been coming out.
Really?
So it's got Matt Fraction writing it, Steve Lieber on artwork with colors by Nathan Fairbairn. It's a Jimmy Olsen book, but what Fraction and Lieber have done is done an homage to the Silver Age Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen book,
right?
Without like making fun of it. You know, saying they're leaning into the silliness of it and kind of making it a sort of metatextual book, but it's a lot of like sort of like, but it's not that smart. You know what I mean? Like it's just a fun book without making you think too much about it. I guess that is what I'm trying to say. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's self-aware. It's self-aware without making fun of the source material. And the premise is that Jimmy Olsen, there's a death threat against him, so he has to leave Metropolis. So he goes to Gotham as under sort of witness protection. So he's living in Gotham as a vlogger named Timmy Olsen. And
okay,
the last issue, he was doing a series of more elaborate video like pranks in order to get Batman's attention. Since Superman can't help him out because that would reveal his identity. So, but it just seems like doing that to get Batman's attention is a bad idea. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
That's what it sounds like to me.
So, at the same time, Fraction and Lieber are also giving you a backstory about Olsen's lineage. Turns out his family has been feuding with Lex Luthor's family in Metropolis for generations. So you get a backstory there. And those sections, the humor that Fraction is doing is breaking the fourth wall. It reminds me, if I'm dating myself with a reference, but if anyone's ever watched Rocky and Bullwinkle, which is even before my time, the humor is very reminiscent of Rocky and Bullwinkle, which is kind of a treat. Because I remember watching this stuff when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah. Me too. I mean, I watched it as a kid.
So, okay.
That's great stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a really fun book. It definitely stands out. It's a nice counterexample to the sort of raunchy humor that Fraction was doing in Sex Criminals. This is more lighthearted. It's a very fun book. And, I think if you're not reading it, definitely track it down in trade when that comes out, because it's a blast.
Yeah, I picked up the first issue of this. I never actually got around to reading it, but this sounds like a good way to convince me to do it. So I will have to grab the first couple of issues of this or something like that, just or the remaining issues of the arc at least. Oh, for me,
fun stuff.
Yeah, for me this week, I am diving into Valiant. I'm going to be the Nick White this episode. I think we kind of talked about it before. Maybe we talked about it on the Discord. Rye number 1 is coming out. This is written by Dan Abnett with art by Juan Jose Rip, and the story is Rye has to save the universe. Sure, I don't really care. Like, it's fine. Whatever Rye needs to do in the weird Valiant universe, I don't really care. I'm here specifically for Dan Abnett and Juan Jose Rip because that is a fucking killer combination of creative team as far as I'm concerned. I will definitely be on board for the first arc of this, if only to see what kind of fucking insane shit Abnett has Jose Rip drawing for this book. Because if I feel like I was really interested in what Matt Kint and Clayton Crane were doing with Rye, and that team drove me to the book. And with Rye, this is again Dan Abnett and Juan Jose Rip. That's what's bringing me to the book. And Rip's art is unbelievable. Like, the dude's done a bunch of really crazy shit over at Avatar, and that's where I first really heard about him. If you ever want to kind of feel a little bit grossed out about superheroes, I would highly suggest reading No Hero. This is by Warren Ellis and Juan Jose Rip. It's kind of gross, kind of out there, but it's definitely a shining example of what Rip's art is capable of doing, which is gross you out, but be incredibly detailed. Like this is the same kind of crazy detail level that you would see in like a James Stokoe, and it's always been impressive to me. But I like the way that this guy shapes people's faces, and I don't know how else to describe it other than that. But I want to see like what's going to happen with this book. I love what the cover's doing already. So I probably need to read all of this Fallen World garbage to get up to date with what's happening in Rye, and I'm willing to do that if it means that I get to jump into this book. So that's what I'm looking forward to this week.
They got you, Mike. The Body Snatchers got you.
They did.
Yeah.
This is the thing, and I mean, let me get on my little tiny, short, very just 2 centimeters tall soapbox really quick here about Valiant. Is the thing that Nick has been telling me since the beginning of like this company is that they do really manage to get outstanding teams by taking the Moneyball, way of doing things and saying, okay, let's find people that are really talented but kind of like under the radar and like bring them in to do something short or in some cases something very long. Let Jeff Lemire and Matt Kint I think are perfect examples of that. That way we can say like when their stuff really starts to blow up in the mainstream side to be like, what else have they done? And Valiant's kind of there to say, look at all this work that we've been working with them for.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. I mean, Dan Abnett has a very long, interesting career in comics. I mean, he's the guy that has essentially made the Marvel Cosmic Universe really interesting again in the early 2000s. And I think the dude really knows how to write sci-fi stories. So I'm very excited to see what he does with Rye. That's really what's driving me into the book.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about zero issues and prologues and whether or not any of us read them or why these issues are important, ? I don't know. We're going to find out after the break. If you haven't heard already, Marvel just released a new podcast about the Fantastic Four called Marvels, based on the infamous graphic novel by Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross. It's made by the same people behind the excellent Wolverine podcast, and it goes into the story of the Fantastic Four's first encounter with Galactus and, his herald, the Silver Surfer. The trailer for this is incredible. This thing sounds amazing, and if you listen to the Wolverine podcast, I think you'll really enjoy this. So if you want to learn more about Marvels, go to marvelspodcast.com, and if you decide you want to give it a listen, go to StitcherPremium.com and sign up with code COMIC. That's COMIC. You'll get a free month trial of Stitcher Premium, which will let you listen to Marvels right now. That's StitcherPremium.com with the promo code COMIC. For our show this week, we are talking about issue zeros, or prologues, or stories that are created to fix a piece of canon before the first issue came out, maybe, in some cases. The question actually around this is, do you read these number zeros? Do you seek them out if you've missed it before the number one? Do they pull you into a new series? I think, Kate, this was kind of a question that you had posed in our doc. We've been using a lot of Kate's ideas lately because Kate's got a lot of really good questions and ideas about comics. But I want to kind of start this with, I haven't seen a number zero in a while until Kate pointed out that the Angel series that came out recently through Boom had a number zero, and it was like the introduction to this new series, which I think kind of goes against the norm for number zeros. So, Kate, could you tell us a little bit about this number zero? Because I know you're jumping into this whole new Buffyverse, right?
I'm trying to. I've read a couple of issues, and I keep pulling it, and I probably have like 10 issues at this point that I haven't read.
Okay.
But
Even of the Angel stuff?
I have not been picking up the Angel stuff because I never really got into the original Angel comics, so I figured I would see if I got into the Buffy comics before I got into anything else with this new canon. And so far the answer is not really in terms of Buffy. So I haven't been picking up Angel, but they did throw Angel Zero into my Buffy subscription, so I did read that one. And they seem to be sticking with the mysterious broody boy of the season 1 Angel from the original show, and I really wasn't a fan of that Angel. I really liked Angel when he became more of his own character and he wasn't so like codependent on Buffy. But it seems to be the same direction that they're going with this Angel number zero, and it just didn't grasp me enough to keep going with his series. But and established what kind of character they were going to go with for the Angel series, and did help me make up my mind as to whether or not to add Angel to my subscription.
Okay. So with this number 0, was it like an introduction to the character and to the series and kind of what it was going to be like then? It was like, I guess, like you said, a prologue of some kind?
Yeah. It showed Angel basically making his decision as to whether or not to seek out this Buffy person, and establishing him as a character in the universe, and basically what his role was going to be.
Right. Okay. Well, it's funny because when you brought this up, it reminded me, I did have a conversation with a guy that I work with, and he told me that he picked up the number 0, and then he picked up the number 1 because he's a diehard Buffy fan, and apparently the number 1 takes a totally different direction.
Huh.
Oh.
So, like, that number 0 wasn't actually a true prologue. I mean, if you're a Buffy reader out there, correct me if I'm wrong, please. But, yeah, I heard this, it actually went in a different direction, so it's kind of funny that number 0 put you off of the series when I think it went in a different direction.
That's kind of what my experience with Buffy has been, though. I mean, I'm such a big fan of Buffy in theory, but then I haven't even finished the original canon in comics, and then I'm multiple issues behind on the new canon. So, am I a fan of the Buffy comics? I don't know anymore.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, what I think is funny, though, is that this number 0 actually came out before the number 1. When I think in 99% of other comics, when a number 0 comes out, it usually comes out after there's been X number of issues. But I don't know. I kind of tried to dig into the history of number 0s before we started the show today. I found some articles, but yeah, I don't know. Paul, what are your thoughts on number 0s?
As someone that started reading comics, my history with comics really starts with the speculation boom of the early 90s, I guess I'm trying to say.
Sure.
So that's when I started reading comics. It's, early 90s, speculation boom is happening. So in my mind, I'm always tied in 0 issues or number 0 as a gimmicky thing. That's in my mind. I connect it to that. Not even the speculation boom, but the right after that, when the market crashes, like, oh shit, we have to convince people to buy our books. Slap a 0 on it. That's cool, right? So it just seems like an easy gimmick. And so in my mind, that's what I associate issue 0s with. I know they serve a purpose, and I think it's a different purpose nowadays. I think the last time I picked one up was on Free Comic Book Day with Transformers versus G.I. Joe's number 0. And again, it's
right.
Idea of a prologue, but the gimmick of putting a 0 on the cover, like that to me is always going to have the stink of the DC 0 hour event, or, bad comics I'd get with my Wizard subscription. Like it's always going to have that taint to it in my eyes.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I think that I'd never really heard of the idea of a 0 issue until maybe 5 or 6 years into reading comics when, there was the big, huge DC 0 issue month that they did. Yeah. And I remember all of this stuff, a bunch of books, I think all the 52 books, and it ended up being 55 books according to Comic Find. All got number 0s, and those number 0s, some of them were prologues, or some of them were none of them were prologues, I should say, because they all came out after there had been established issues of all of the series that were in the DC continuity, and those 0 issues were just kind of here's what happened right before the number 1 issue, or here's how this character, what their history was and how they got connected with other people, maybe giving some information into Batman, before he was actually Batman or Superman when he was still a teenager, all that kind of stuff, and it was always, to me, it felt like a huge gimmick, and I know that Marvel's done it occasionally, and I maybe have come across it, I don't think I actually physically own any number 0s, but I know that I've read trades that contain number 0s that were just in a random thing, instead of putting out an annual, a series will put out a number 0 issue or something if it's about a solo character to give you some weird backstory. To me, it always feels like a course correction if they're trying to retcon something or introduce a character that's supposed to be super well established in some character's backstory but has never been written into the comic. And so they're like, oh, no, here's a number 0. It's like, look, they go way back 20 years. Nightcrawler's best friend actually was a guy back in Germany who had a mustache that turned into, 2 arms coming out of his face. See, guys? I mean, I'm completely making that up, but
You could have convinced me that was actually an X-Men story,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that's X-Men, but at the same time, like that's the way that I feel number zeros have always been treated. And, you know, I I did do a little bit of other digging, and maybe I'll save it for a little bit, but
Okay.
I will read a little bit of this one answer that I read on this site. So Stack Exchange, which is like a website where people can just kind of ask questions about any topic, and they all have these subsites. There's particularly, this site is like usually used for coding. Like Stack Overflow is this major website where people like ask code questions, you get responses. And I guess somebody was like, well, what if we just did this for anything? So there's like a sci-fi subsite, and somebody asked, you know, what are comics number 0 for? What are they for? And this guy had a basic question, and the answer for this one I liked was an issue number 0 is usually a backstory issue that covers information the reader needs to know in order to continue on to an event, which is perfect. Like an example that comes to mind is the Blackest Night issue number 0, which basically gave background on each of the colored lantern corps of the emotional spectrum and followed it and showed a few stories on why they're significant to the plot of the overall event. Like perfectly answering my whole thought of this is just a gimmick to retcon some continuity. But
yeah, I mean,
yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, well, that's the idea of the issue 0. You know, I remember being young enough to think it was cool the first time I saw that, because the idea is like, oh, this takes place before the first issue, right? It's implied in the issue 0. So the idea of that being a sort of outside continuity, and that's how DC used it, both in the New 52, like you mentioned, and back in 0 Hour, which, you know, I recently reread. You can hear my thoughts on that in a recent issue of the podcast. But after that miniseries, they did the same thing, whereas across the board, resetting the character's continuity by having every issue have an issue 0. The problem is you can't really do that again, right? You can't have issue 0. I mean, I guess technically Marvel did do like
I was going to say
whatever issues, yeah.
Marvel did point issues because they just wanted to milk more money out of you for months and months. They did .INH, they did a dot everything, Paul. Don't get me fucking started on the dot issues, man.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, we could do a whole other topic episode about the half issues that I remember being popular in the 90s too. So it's issue 1/2. So it's between 0 and 1, you know? So,
yeah.
But, the problem is with nowadays, now you have most mainstream superhero comics are simply being rebooted every time there's a new creative team. You get a brand new number 1. It kind of defeats the purpose of having a sort of prologue 0 issue at this point. But, you know, as we've said, the idea of it being something for a smaller publisher, like or a free comic book day giveaway as a sort of thing to hook a new reader, that's the sort of purpose I see them serving now, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and to get to kind of the question from the beginning of the episode, you know, do you seek these out? Like if you see a number 0 coming out in previews or it's on the shelf or something, is it something you're like, oh, I'm going to grab that to see what everything's all about? Or do you feel like even though there's supposed to be issues that take place before issue number 1, they're still so heavily rooted in some sort of continuity that you're lost when you read them? I mean, Kate, I'd be curious to know if you've done that with any, like, superhero books. Have you picked up anything that's been like, oh, I'm going to try this, it's going to get me into this book, and then it turns out it wasn't?
The only issue 0 I've ever seen sitting on a shelf is Lady Mechanica, and I had never read any Lady Mechanica at all, but it being the issue 0 made me know that it was before the canon really started, so I wasn't going to miss anything.
Gotcha.
So I was drawn to that because I knew I wasn't going to be out of my depth.
Okay.
All of the other prologues that I've read have kind of found me, like with the Angel 0 being in my subscription box, and then the only other prologue I can think of that I've read is Isola, which came again with my subscription to Isola. It came with issue number 6, and it was just a short, like maybe 10-page story, and that. Like, you keep mentioning that maybe it's going to answer some questions that have been left out of the canon, and I think that the Isola prologue did do that. It filled in a whole bunch of backstory questions that I had, which I don't think were necessary to have answered. It didn't fix anything that was wrong with the canon. It just answered a bunch of my questions that I felt hadn't been answered for the first 5 issues and were kind of becoming baggage.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I'm stumped because I am actually hearing that a number 0 or a prologue helped you, and that like breaks my brain to a certain extent, because I feel like a lot of these pull you in and you're like, I need to read this because you need to keep up with the story. I mean, all of the dot issues, for instance, in Marvel, is a big gimmick, but in my head, I'm like, this is important to an event that I'm reading, so I need to read it. And I usually come away disappointed. I'm like, God damn it, Marvel, you got me for $4 again. But this is my superhero or supervillain origin story. By the way, the dot issues were simply too much, and so the evil Mike Rappin rose to power, promising to destroy all gimmicky comic book tropes, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I think the problem for me is that, it does feel like a gimmick, because if the issue 0 is a prologue, then it's just the first issue. It should just have a number 1 on the cover. The examples that we've been giving, a lot of them are from Free Comic Book Day, which I guess the implication there is that, hey, if you missed out on it because your store didn't have it, that's okay. You can still get the first issue, when it comes out in a few months. But the example of Transformers versus G.I. Joes, I knew I wanted to read that book, the minute I heard about it, so I tracked down the 0 issue, but in my mind, it was just the first issue. It wasn't because it was a prologue, because I was going to read that book no matter what, as part of the experience of reading that book.
Well, and I wonder if in some cases, like the problem with number ones, I think that we've talked about a handful of thousands of times, is that, they got to hook you. The first issue's got to bring you in. And in some cases, maybe a number 0 doesn't have as interesting of a hook as maybe the first issue would, like to hear and sit back and hear the origin of, the two main characters from Saga, maybe that's not as interesting of a story as, oh shit, a baby's being born and like we've got to run from the cops. Like that's a more interesting hook for a number 1. I mean, if we get rid of the idea that a Brian K. Vaughan book is just going to sell regardless, like if you take a book like that, it's the prologue of like maybe the history of Wraith and I don't remember the names of anything. I've read this book like 3 times over. You think I'd remember all the characters and stuff, but to hear the history of maybe the war is maybe not as interesting as the actual action-packed first issue. And some creators are just, maybe they want to wait and hold that prologue stuff until later, like in the example of Isola, or Isla, or however that book is pronounced, where they waited to give some of the history and background until later, once people were actually on board for the main story. So yeah, I don't know. I guess the thing about these books is, do you think that if you didn't read some of these number 0s that you'd be missing out on? I mean, or missing out on things? Like, do these issues have that much weight that you really need to read them? Otherwise, what was the point of them? I don't know. Do you guys feel like if you don't read them, you'll be missing out?
Not in terms of the ones that I've read so far. I think they all contribute to the story, but none of them have been necessary for my understanding of the story. Which I think that reminds me a lot of this trend in prose young adult books, where once a book gets popular, they'll put out a prologue or a 0.5 novella in that canon, so that it draws people in that are already fans of the story, and it just kind of adds to the universe. And I think that's kind of what these comics have done, is to just give you more time with those characters and to contribute to your understanding of what's going on, but it's just more content for people that already like it.
But then what's the point of me writing all this fan fiction, Kate? That's interesting. I didn't know that happened in prose. That's actually genuine news to me.
Yeah, that's been happening a lot since the Twilight days, probably. Once something hits like a bestseller list, you're almost for sure going to see like a 0.1 or a 0.5 story come along. If it's a series. That to me kind of reminds me of kind of the model of, I think, really popular manga in Japan, where you'll see the manga become super popular and then maybe a sub-series will come out that's not necessarily important to the main storyline, but it is about either characters in that shared universe, or maybe there'll be like what they call like a light novel, which is just like a small novella that's about all the characters. That they'll do all sorts of gimmicky things. I mean, on top of an anime, just to give folks more interaction with those characters. I that's almost like, now that I think about it, kind of nice to hear that that's happening, because in some cases, like maybe you really do want more Harry Potter books. I want more Harry Potter books. But the content's just not out there. But that's to know, what if Harry Potter came out
today rather than,
Right.
15, 20 years ago. Like, would we be seeing like sub Harry Potter books that are like overseen by JK and like there's more content about the Hogwarts school, or maybe we'll get that forever, or, everyone in the world seems to want like what if we did a story about James and Sirius and Lupin and, all those people back in the day. I wonder if that would be more of a push just because Scholastic maybe wants more of that book. Wow.
I think that's how we got the Wires and Nerve books, actually, that are comics. Those came out of Cinder by Melissa Meyer. Mm-hmm. And that's about...
I have those 2 volumes sitting on my shelf. I've never read the actual prose books.
Yeah, I love the series. There is a lot of extra stuff that ties into that series, including those comics, which I'm really excited about, that they're doing a lot of adaptations and continuations in comics from prose books. Anyway, that's I digress.
No, I think that's interesting because I feel like, number zeros maybe are trying to be that, but it always feels more gimmicky because they feel like optional issues in a lot of cases. Like, Paul, it's interesting that you were like, I got to get this Transformers vs. G.I. Joe book because do you think that if you missed that zero issue, you would have missed out on the rest of the book? Like, maybe you didn't get some information about some random one-off Transformer that turns into a screwdriver or something that would have made the series less rich for you.
No, I don't think so. I think the zero issue was, as you've been talking, I kind of had this thought that issue functioned as a sort of dropping you into the series, get you excited, and then the first issue number 1, had a very different sort of storytelling pace. So almost as if the issue 0, as with the Transformers versus G.I. Joe example, the Green Lantern example you gave earlier, it's a way of doing an information dump without interrupting the sort of narrative pace of the rest of the series. That makes sense?
Gotcha. Yeah. So, that makes absolute sense.
So there's a structure that a 22-page issue of a comic book would have, and I think for some creators, the necessity of having the info exposition dump for a big event would interrupt that. So, I'll just put that in issue 0, and then, the actual issue itself will have the same pace that I want, as story beats go, which, and then that's the implication I got. But I'm not going to miss out on a Tom Scioli comic, Mike. So Transformers vs. G.I. Joe issue 0, I was going to get my hands on one way or the other. There was no question.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, the only little bit of trivia that I had left about issue 0s was that there's like some history. Like, CBR did an article a while ago about the history of number zeros. This is in 2015. The comic book questions answered article, what was the first number 0 issue? And there was a little bit of discussion in the article, but the guy that wrote this thought, it was Magnus Robot Fighter number 0 that came out in 1992. Was that the first ever 0 issue? And it turns out that it wasn't. The first one that the guy found was a number 0 of Zap, and actually that wasn't like a prologue by any means. It was actually the first issue of the series. I think R. Crumb put out the first issue of this as number 0. Just was like, I'm starting it. This is number 0. They didn't have any more information other than that. It's just like, that was the first one, the end. But it turns out there's an even older one. This is 1983's, maybe, these dates are all wrong. 1968 was Zap Comics, but then apparently there was another book called Albedo. It came out as a number 0 in 1983. I don't know. And it was dubbed the first real issue. I don't know. It's a whole thing. It's a really weird article. I kind of forget that CBR articles are kind of just 12 pictures and 16 words. So not a lot of info. But Zap Comics was the first number 0. I've never read any Zap Comics, but I'm guessing it's not like an origin of anything. It's just the first issue.
It definitely feels like mocking the idea of numbering comics. Like it's a little funny joke that R. Crumb probably had, right?
Sure. The guy was a wild person, so yeah.
Yeah, and again, to me, like the number 0, that to me is always going to stick out as an early 90s thing. And I probably had a bunch of them that I bought or got for free with my Wizard magazine subscription, and they were all sold off long ago. So you can see the importance of them, And again, like most 90s fads, your 50-cent or dollar bins at your local comic book shops are going to be lousy with number zeros. So if you want to find them, there's plenty there probably.
Yeah. We still, one day we will do, like, I feel like we got to do that thing that Paul, I think you pitched maybe 2 or 3 years ago of like, go to a dollar bin, grab a random comic, and let's just talk about that as the topic. I think that's like a really fun idea, especially if something that you have no knowledge on. Like, I'm not going to go pick up an old X-Men comic because that would be no fun, but I think it would be really funny for me to just grab a random Jimmy Olsen comic and just bring it in and be like, I know nothing about Jimmy Olsen, let alone the comics that he was in. And I mean, I know at Emerald City I did pick up a bunch of random issues just based on the wild cover that they had. Superman, my friend, my enemy, ? It's Superman blowing laser beams at Jimmy Olsen. Like, that's the coolest thing in the world.
Basically,
but, yeah. We'll get there one day. But I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts on issue zeros? I feel like there was. It feels like this is just a big gimmick still. I feel like there isn't really a huge point to them, but I don't know if you guys have changed your minds at all.
Well, as I said, I think their function has changed or been shifted to something else. Because as we've been talking, I also remembered that I recently read the Brian Michael Bendis Legion of Superheroes reboot, and he did a little 2-issue prologue, which, I mean, probably back in the 90s would have been an oversized 0 issue, but now it's like, I'll do a 2-issue miniseries to set everything up, then issue 1 of my series will come out. So, and I think with the frequency of series being renumbered, it defeats the purpose of having a prologue issue like that. But as I said earlier, I think when they pop up on Free Comic Book Day, it seems superfluous, but your mileage may vary, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Kate? You going to go back and try Angel #1 now that I've maybe changed your mind a little bit about it?
Probably not, unless I get even more into the Buffy, the new Buffy comics. But I do want to read any extra books that come out within the series that I'm already into. So, Isola, Lady Mechanica, for example.
Yeah.
But I would also read the Christmas specials for the Giant Days books. I read those too, and those don't necessarily inform the canon. They just add to my enjoyment.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who reads the X-Men, I get you. My always go-to. Though I will say, not all of those X-Men little extra books are winners. Hottest take of the year, last year's Christmas special was not my favorite thing in the world. Didn't actually finish it.
Wow.
I know. I feel like I'm gonna get stabbed now through the internet. But, anyways, I want to say, thanks guys for joining me this week. You can follow us all on the internet. You can follow Kate at Kate Elfier. You can follow Paul at Paul, Oh Hi Paulie. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. You can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where I post on Twitter and Instagram and try to be active. I was active on Twitter right before this show started recording, so please go follow us there if you haven't already.
This show is powered by fans like you who join us over at Patreon. You can find our Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. If you sign up over there, you get access to exclusive audio. You get the episodes early. There's articles up there, previews of our IRCB schedule of upcoming stuff, early access to the Top of My Piles post, and much, much more. Our Goodreads group is a lovely community of comic book friends who talk about comics and read a bunch of comics over there. You can join our yearly reading challenge, which I'm woefully behind on. You can comment on our weekly discussion threads. I think this week's discussion thread, Kara posted something about problematic favorites. Interesting discussion over there, so you can check that out at ircbpodcast.com/goodreads. Speaking of ircbpodcast.com, that's your headquarters for all things IRCB, including our creator pronunciation guide, our Discord server, zines, merch you can buy, and everything else I read comic books.
If you haven't already, please rate and review our show 5 stars on iTunes and all of the other podcatchers that you listen to, and we'll read your review on the next episode. Email the show with what you've been reading, recipes, corrections, maybe some compliments at ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. Their new album is fantastic. Go check it out on Bandcamp or on Spotify, wherever you listen to music. Xander is a high wizard of the grandest kind, a good friend, and a great DM. He edits our show. I want to say thank you to Paul and Kate for being on the episode. You guys are amazing. I'm so glad I get to talk to you this week. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.
So is everybody caught up on The Mandalorian? Can we talk about it?
I haven't seen episode 2 yet. I was going to watch it tonight.
Come on.
I know.
Okay.
I was going to watch it tonight.
The Mandalorian.
I thought you were going to watch The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kelly hasn't watched episode 1 yet, and it's been killing me.
Yeah, so Kate and I would just watch both episodes this morning,
Oh, nice.
and she hadn't seen it yet. And like she was kind of half paying attention, and like the Werner Herzog scene she thought was cool, but then at the end I'm like, you have to watch the last scene,
Yeah.
like you just have to see what the big reveal is. And of course she was immediately like, she's like, I'm sold. Yeah, I'll watch this show.
I know.
So,
I think that I've got to imagine that I can talk about vague things. Be quiet. That I got to imagine that Jon Favreau was like, if people aren't on board by the end of episode 1, they won't be on board, period. And I think like he was
Right.
ready to draw that line in the sand, but I have a feeling that he's going to rope in like, with that, he roped in 90% of people who were on the fence. Like, I totally
yeah,
feel
exactly.
it that way.
Yeah.
Somebody told me that the reason why that whole scene happened is because they brought George Lucas back or something. Like,
I'm sure they consulted him, right?
well,
about it, so,
the thing about it is that with those, trying to be vague so that I don't spoil it for Kelly.
Yeah.
With that specific thing, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. George Lucas was like, that is off limits if I sell this company. No one can tell that story. And
I see.
I guess they brought him back and they're letting Jon Favreau tell that story, which I'm like, all right, man, let's figure it
Interesting.
out.
Okay.
Because like,
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
whole lot of questions about what the fuck where that came from.
Exactly. Yep. Oh yeah.
Brian was saying they don't even have a name for the race.
They don't.
Right.
Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
Yeah, they never said it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. It's not a place that I thought the show was going to go. Not that I had any specific
Definitely not.
expectations, but
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I figured it was just going to be like a handful of little one-off things about like various bounty hunter stories.
Yeah.
Which, like, I'm fine with them doing a continuous storyline. That's fine. I just hope
Yeah.
they know where to end it. Like, I hope it has an ending in mind. That's all that I'm praying for.
Yeah. I think that this hints at that definitely will, because Werner Herzog's, the client, there's obviously ties to the Empire there, whatever's left of it. So I think there's a much bigger story, but I like that it's kind of focused on this one narrative of him finding the bounty and trying to get back home. But there's clearly hints at something much bigger
Yeah.
at stake, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Especially given Werner Herzog's character and like what he's doing, which like, please tell me he's in the show more. I really hope. Like, you watch episode 2, so you can tell me if he's in the show more or not. That's all I can handle for spoilers.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, not the second. I'm sure he'll come back later in the season. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
But-
yeah.
So this isn't spoiler, but I was reading somebody was talking about they went to a screening. There's a Q&A thing or something, and like someone told a story about being on set and they were filming a scene with the baby, but they were using a puppet, and they would do the CGI later on. And then Werner Herzog asked Jon Favreau, was like, well, why didn't you just use the footage you just shot with the puppet? And then Jon Favreau was explaining, like, they're going to do some additional CGI special effects. And, like, Werner Herzog just says, you are cowards for not using a puppet, which is the funniest thing ever.
I mean, but it's true, though. Like, look at Dark Crystal, like, as a show.
Yeah, exactly.
Dark Crystal, like, they can do it. You can do it. It's possible. So,
Yeah.
I feel like they
It's
have
bad,
done
yeah.
quite a bit of puppetry with Mandalorian.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nick Nolte's
Just that
character.
one character. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, brother.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, Kelly's watching it now, so she's going to have a lot of questions, I think, after we're done recording the show. And at some point, she's going to go, and I just hope it gets captured on audio. That's all.
Me too. Yeah.
I know you can. I know you can hear me.